What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions for Battle Brothers, because it is time, finally, for me to start this one, as it has been one of those games that people have been requesting for me to take a look at for a substantial amount of time. Years, in fact. I've had this game sitting in my Steam library since I think it was like 2023 when people were asking me about it, and I knew I was eventually going to cover it. And obviously, I am finally getting around to it. But what is Battle Brothers, if you are completely unaware? Simply put, it is a TRPG where you lead a band of mercenaries across a procedurally generated map. Eventually, as you work your way up through the sort of ranks of notoriety, you'll start encountering the late-game crises that you'll also have to find your way through, and there's DLC that's added more content to the game since its initial launch, obviously, back in 2017. And one of the reasons that it's taken me so long to get around to this game is because I've known for a fact it is pretty big if you want to try and see everything. Just the achievements usually take between like 100 and 150 hours, and that in and of itself is going to take multiple mercenary companies, and that probably brings me to the first thing I want to really mention here, is that Battle Brothers, in its truest form, I would say, is a game about taking these mercenary companies as far as you can go through multiple playthroughs. I think getting overly attached to any one of them is probably a bit of a mistake, as sort of loss and comebacks are the nature of the game here. And while on a regular playthrough, you can in fact like save and reload and everything, so it's not inherently Iron Man, though that is certainly an option. Don't necessarily expect everything to work out, as I've already learned a couple of tough lessons that I remember people mentioning to me, but a little too late as it was. But in order to start all these mercenary companies, you first have to start a new campaign, obviously, and that begins with picking your starting company, or your company origin. Basically, where your starting troop comes from. There's a whole host of these. Some of them are just kind of generic. There's one specifically for the tutorial, which I obviously checked out first. And then there's a bunch that have more specific details, like say you want to have something akin to like a group of witchers. You could take the Beast Slayer's company origin, and that kind of leans into that kind of thing. Whereas stuff like the Lone Wolf origin sees you starting with just a single member, and if that person dies, it's just game over. So you have to keep that singular person alive, as opposed to the typical entire company. One of my personal favorites, and the one I'm excited to play with the most, but it's going to be more of a late game thing, is actually the Davkul Cultists. Basically, these guys worship an elder god, and like every so many in-game days, they have to sacrifice one of their number, which can lead to perks for all of the other ones that are left, eventually leading you to a prophet of their order, as an example of a way that these things can modify the gameplay in substantial ways. Already a pretty good start, so you're going to then name that company, and then you can, if you want to, choose to pick which of the 4 late game crises you would like to see first, and then all of them are randomized afterwards. You can also choose to turn on permanent destruction, that is to say that these crises you can run into in the late game can actually legitimately destroy towns if you turn that on. And then what follows is the difficulty settings. Now, I thought these were especially interesting because, for starters, they show your map seed for the procedurally generated map, meaning things like towns and stuff aren't always going to be in the same place, and, if they're of the same name at all. But there are, of course, some like general themes to each one. Now, generally, the game itself will pretty much tell you to start on beginner, and then you can choose Iron Man from there. Now, later on, I'll be jumping into like veteran and expert just to see what that's like, but obviously, at least for the first couple of campaigns, go how they might. I'm going to ease my way into it, which I would probably recommend just from what I've played, simply because of the hit chance stuff we're about to get into. So a brutal lesson that I learned pretty quickly is that you're going to want to focus primarily on hit chance in the early game with all of your mercenaries here. So basically, in the beginning, you're going to be lucky to have like 30 to 40% chance to hit in some cases, unless you really go out of your way to optimize it. And unfortunately, at the beginning of the game, you just don't seem to have a lot of options for that outside of just trying to use basically spears and flanking around characters. This is because your brothers here need to get leveled up so they can start picking various perks, which you're going to, of course, help them out, in addition with better equipment as you get leveled up in gold and everything, to actually be able to hit something. And I learned this the hard way by essentially surrounding one of the early bosses for the tutorial sort of company origin only for this singular guy who was supposed to be the tutorial boss to wipe out like 6 people on his own. Mostly just because I kept missing over and over and over again. I've already sort of adjusted for that, looked up some best practices, that kind of thing, but I just kind of wanted to point out how very specific the game seems to need to be played in the beginning, at least. I am curious how that's going to open up, because there are all sorts of like weapon types and things, you know, like axes that can split shields. Shields obviously do a number on your hit chance. There's other modifiers, things like morale and fatigue of each individual character as they use their abilities, and that's just in combat itself, because outside of combat you also have to manage all of these characters, which includes feeding them, repairing their equipment as it gets damaged, keeping their morale high, things like that. Now, most of that is done simply by doing the obvious thing: resting, going into town, buying supplies, making sure you've got enough food with you. You do have to worry about that spoiling. And I've actually played a few games like this that, also have those mechanics, so that in and of itself is not a huge deal to me. But you also have to decide when to take on certain mercenaries, and that's important because each of them has like a little backstory and traits and things you'll need to understand, ideally, to make the most use of them. For instance, in one of the earlier campaigns, I found a bunch of people that were decent new hires, but they all had a pretty big aversion to greenskins or orcs. And that's something I would, want to remember if I was going to take this particular company all the way to that final in-game crisis that sees them fighting orcs. Though that particular campaign was short-lived, but that kind of thing is what you have to keep in mind. Now, another interesting thing about this, though, is that, like a lot of these more open-ended mercenary games, the game is mostly over when you feel like it's over, and many of your own goals are simply running down each individual contract, but you can also, on occasion, pick certain ambitions. These ambitions are kind of like broader quests that you give yourself, typically like making friends with a town or a settlement or nobles, that kind of thing, or just various goals you can pursue in addition to your actual individual contracts for settlements and whatnot. But assuming you're just kind of done with an individual mercenary company and you want to just start over and try something new, you can, if you don't just straight up die, choose to retire instead, which based on your renown and how well you did will give you like an end slide and stuff. But as first impressions go, happy with all of the replayability and things like that. Clearly have a lot to learn in terms of like best practices, mostly in getting going after my initial sort of failed one where I died mostly to that tutorial guy. I kind of, again, looked up some best practices for things like overcoming the hit chance in particular, and the second run is already going a little better. Was able to, get some contracts actually finished, and I'll continue to play out campaigns and kind of see how that goes before I start making more serious efforts towards like specific achievements and stuff, which is going to take some time. Which I think really highlights the replayability of this one more than anything, which is honestly a good chunk of what I'm looking forward to, especially with some of the unique mechanics of those individual company origins. And that stuff combined with exactly how in-depth the combat gets with like the late game crises as an example. I want to see how tactical that really gets with like all the different weapon types and gear, and of course high-level characters to actually play around with. As I've heard, it's pretty good, albeit maybe a little slow given the turn-based nature and just how many characters can be on screen at a time. But all in all, first impressions, this is going to be the beginning of a very long journey, and as such, while I do plan on reviewing this in my typical fashion, that is, simply put, going to take a while. I'm going to finish up Heretic and Hexen first, and then on top of that, I've got like 3 or 4 things I can't talk about right this moment over the course of August anyway, and I will be playing this kind of in the background as all of that stuff happens. So I wouldn't expect to see that review until probably sometime in September, give or take. But either way, I'm certainly looking forward to it. I hope you are as well. If you have any advice or specific things you'd like me to see in the nature of this procedural generation, by all means, drop it down in the comments section below. Which, of course, means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.